Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining me this morning. We will be doing chapter 16. It has to do with how Satan can potentially use the church, small c, uh, in his effort to bring about the kind of temptation that would shipwreck or destroy a person's life or faith. Um, I have some biblical texts for you that I'm going to include towards the end of my podcast. We have a number of people who oftentimes join us later, and I want to make sure that they hear this because many probably wouldn't go back and see what they might have missed. So I will add these biblical texts later. I think that they are very important and helpful in relationship to this particular chapter. So, so we take a shift now. We've moved from a number of different themes in the past, and now this primary theme has to do with the patient's involvement in the church and how Screwtape is counseling Wormwood to um, to use the church in whatever way possible to mitigate and even or try to destroy the patient's uh, faith. So, without any further ado, I'll go ahead and begin. My dear Wormwood, you mentioned casually in your last letter that the patient has continued to attend one church, and one only, since he was converted, and that he is not wholly pleased with it. Surprise, surprise, huh? May I ask what you are about? Why have I no report on the causes of his fidelity to the parish church? Do you realize that unless it is due to indifference, it is a very bad thing? Surely you know that if a man can't be cured of church going, the next best thing is to send him all over the neighborhood looking for the church that, quote, suits, end quote, him until he has become a taster or connoisseur of churches. So, there are a couple things in this particular paragraph that are important to consider. The first of which is that this patient has been attending this one particular church the entire time, and even though he's not wholly pleased with it. So I remember years ago when I used to attend St. Stephen's in Sewickley, PA. Dr. John Guest, who was there, and this was a church that had almost anything that you could even begin to think about having. And in my mind, it was, it was unbelievable. The facility, the technology, the teaching, everything. It was hard to believe that there could be people dissatisfied with that kind of a church. But I remember Dr. Guest preaching one Sunday morning saying to the entire congregation, if any of you ever find the perfect church and you go there, it will cease to be perfect. And so there was this eruption of laughter, you know, uh, based on his comment. And I think that's largely true. So here's this patient. He's been attending a church, the same church, since his conversion, faithfully, even though he is not wholly pleased with it. And then so he goes on to say, do you realize that unless it's due to indifference, it's a very bad thing? So he's setting up the argument about why fidelity or commitment to a local church, a local good church, is a bad thing for Satan, unless it's due to indifference. So if it's due to indifference, then there's a kind of cynicism, a detachment that that is there, that no matter what happens in that church wouldn't impact or affect that person altogether. And if with that kind of indifference and disconnection, uh, it probably would serve Satan well, for a person to be like that in a church, and then to go out into the world and to live his life or her life in such a way that nothing is consistent. There isn't anything consistent about their life in relationship to what the church is supposed to be about. So it's a poor witness kind of thing in most cases anyway. Surely you know that if a man can't be cured of church going, the next best thing is to send him all over the neighborhood looking for the church that, quote, suits, end quote, him until he has become a taster, or connoisseur of churches. And so when a person becomes a taster or a connoisseur of churches, there is a difference between a person who's looking for a church that has really important um, uh, principles, really important aspects to that church that make it uh, worthy of going to, versus a person who puts themselves kind of in the driver's seat. They become the authority, right? And evaluate churches oftentimes on criteria that are not eternal in nature, are inconsequential, and so they become cynical, and they won't connect. They don't attach themselves to a local church, and certainly don't, in a very biblical way, in a very spirit-led way, place themselves under the authority of whoever is leading that church in that kind of a way. So people who church hop, people who church shop, are people who tend to be difficult to please, and they see themselves as an authority, and they place themselves above, usually in an extra biblical sort of fashion. They place themselves above um, whatever is happening in that church. So uh, that's kind of what we're getting at here. He goes on to say, the reasons are obvious. In the first place, the parochial organization should always be attacked because, being a unity of place and not of likings, it brings people of different classes and psychology together in the kind of unity the enemy desires. So there's a fair amount going on here. But being the parochial organization should always be attacked. So a church that's whole, a church that's focused, a church that's unified, he says, should always be attacked. And it oftentimes is. Being a unity of place and not of likings. So, you know, the greater, higher principle here is to be unified as a church. And that's why people come together, not just because they like it. It brings people of different classes and psychology, so it represents the body of Christ and the kind of unity the enemy desires. The congregational principle, on the other hand, makes each church into a kind of club. And finally, if all goes well, into a coterie, which is a kind of small group, or faction. A coterie or faction. So he goes on to say the congregational principle, on the other hand, versus the unity. The congregational principle, on the other hand, makes each church into a kind of club. And finally, if all goes well, into it. So it's an us versus them. It's an exclusive kind of mentality that it begins to form. And so Screwtape is saying, we want a church that has an us versus them mentality towards not only the world, but also towards other believers. That's what we want, Screwtape is saying. In the second place, the search for a, quote, suitable, end quote, church makes the man a critic where the enemy wants him to be a pupil, which is what I was saying a little bit earlier. And what a great phrase. In the second place, the search for a quote suitable end quote church makes the man a critic where the enemy wants him to be a pupil. And so the reason why we attend church, one of many reasons, is so that we can learn, so that God can teach us, not just through the pastor teaching or through Sunday school or through small groups, but that we can learn through example. We can learn as we look at the lives of other people and things like that. And so we're there with a servant's heart, and we want to be taught because we realize that we have not arrived. There's so much more that we can learn. And so God wants us to attend a church for many reasons, but one of the primary of which would be to be a pupil, to be a student. What he wants of the layman in church is an attitude which may, indeed, be critical in the sense of rejecting what is false or unhelpful, but which is wholly uncritical in the sense that it does not apprise, does not waste time in thinking about what it rejects, but lays itself open in an uncommenting, humble receptivity to any nourishment that is going. So, so Lewis is qualifying or bringing a bit more clarity to what he was saying. What he wants the layman in the church, that is you and me, is an attitude which may indeed be critical in the sense of rejecting what is false or unhelpful. So, and I mean, so a couple of things. One is because of our fallen nature, all of us, all of us are heretics in varying degrees. But but there is a break point there. There is a point where there's a sense in which I'm a heretic because I don't fully understand the full nature and counsel of God. And sometimes in my teaching, I may not give that full nature or counsel of God, or it may not be exactly right, but there isn't anything intentional about that. And then because I'm in a unified body, if there's something that I don't get quite right or don't fill out entirely, there's another person who can add to that and layer that so that we get a fuller, more accurate picture of what God's counsel is or what his nature is or those kinds of things. All of that is different. It's okay to be critical of that in a good way. But what we need to be critical of is false teaching that is intentional, that is sloppy, that is uncaring. And there are too many churches like that. There's a ton of teaching out there right now that is trendy, right? That is extra biblical in order to be socially acceptable. There's all kinds of teaching like that out there. And we should be critical of that, and we should reject that, not necessarily in an angry fashion, but in a knowing, perceptive, firm kind of way. I mean, there are certain things that we simply cannot surrender when it comes to the Christian faith. And so, what he wants of the layman in church is an attitude which may indeed be critical in the sense of rejecting what is false or unhelpful, but which is wholly uncritical in the sense that it does not apprise, does not waste time. In other words, it does not apprise in terms of placing the wrong kind of value on things, does not waste time in thinking about what it rejects. We don't get obsessed about certain things within the church that really don't matter. Is it the main thing? Does it really matter that thing exists? So there are many Christians over the course of history who will go to a church, and on the whole, the church preaches the gospel. It is doctrinally sound. It does a great job. There are wonderful people there, but for some reason, there are some people who, when they go to that church, they don't like a particular thing. They don't like the color of the seat cushions in the church. They don't like about that. They don't like the way in which how a decision was made or what staff person was hired or those kinds of things. And so they become critical of that church. and destructive and sometimes divisive. And so that's the kind of person that Screwtape is talking about here, that we have to be very careful about those kinds of people. So, uh, what he wants of the layman in church is an attitude which may indeed be critical in the sense of rejecting what is false or unhelpful, but which is wholly uncritical in the sense that it does not attach false value, does not waste time in thinking about what it rejects, does not become obsessed about things that don't matter, but lays itself open to uncommenting, humble receptivity to any nourishment that is going. And so, it is possible in many churches to eat the meat and spit out the bones, right? Uh, and I think that's, I mean, I think that almost every church that you would go to, there are many of them that, where when you go to, you just have to eat the meat. You're not going to like everything about it, but you got to eat the meat and spit out the bones. So you see how groveling, how unspiritual, how irredeemably vulgar he is. So this person is hanging in there in that church because he's eating the meat and spitting out the bones. And so Screwtape is describing him as groveling, unspiritual, and irredeemably vulgar, right? This attitude, especially during sermons, creates the condition most hostile to our whole policy, in which platitudes can become really audible to the human soul. So, so Screwtape is saying, look, if there is a person who's there who can lay aside the things that they do not agree with and remain teachable, be a pupil, be a student, and know how to keep the right things in the right place and just not obsess about any wrong things that might be there, that person, Screwtape is saying, is really dangerous to how Satan works in this world. There is hardly any sermon or any book which may not be dangerous to us if it is received in this temper. I want to learn. I want to be open. I want to hear the Holy Spirit speak to me. And so whatever is being said, that's what I want to hear. That's how I want to be changed, and whatever is good. And so Screwtape is saying, look, that kind of attitude, there's hardly any sermon or any book which may not be dangerous to us, to the things of Satan, if it's received with this kind of temper that I just described to you. So pray, bestir yourself, and send this fool the round of the neighboring churches as soon as possible. Your record up to date has not given us much satisfaction. So then he goes on to say, he gives some examples of a couple of churches that are in the neighborhood where the patient is. The two churches nearest to him I have looked up in the office. Both have certain claims. The first of these is the vicar, or the priest, who is a man who has been so long engaged in watering down the faith to make it easier for a supposedly incredulous and hard-hearted congregation, that is now he who shocks his parishioners with his unbelief, not vice versa. So here is a pastor, a priest, a vicar, who is so intent on being relevant, being cool, being accepted, that he's really forsaken the tenets of his faith, and he has uh, instead what he's done is he's taken the things of the world and tried to apply them in the sacred context of the church itself, rather than taking the sacred context of the church and all the things that belong to that and be able to see through that lens into the world. So this priest has abandoned his faith, and now the congregants are more shocked by him. And by the way, I just want to tell you, I know and have known pastors like that very clearly. They're insecure. Uh, they don't live principled, biblical principled lives. Um, they feel as if they have to almost apologize for the church and for the historical positions, the doctrinal positions that the church has taken, and they try to lead their congregants into the world. I mean, I'm not kidding you. They try to lead their congregants into the world rather than leading the world into the body of their congregants to receive uh, resolute and vibrant biblical teaching. It's stunning. So at first, uh, at the first of these is the vicar is a man who has been so long engaged in watering down the faith to make it easier for a supposedly incredulous and hard-hearted congregation that it is now he who shocks his parishioners with his unbelief, not vice versa. He has undermined many a soul's Christianity. His conduct of the services is also admirable, says Satan, or one of his demons, in order to spare the laity all, quote, difficulties, end quote. He has deserted both the lectionary and the appointed psalms, and now, without noticing it, revolves endlessly round the little treadmill of his 15 favorite psalms and 20 favorite lessons. So Lewis is clearly talking about how they worship. This is an Anglican style of worship, and they used a book called the Book of Common Prayer, or the BCP. And the BCP has a lectionary. So every day is worked out. It's almost like a devotional. Every day. So I think they call them Rite 1, Rite 2, and I think there's a Rite 3. It's been a while since I looked at the BCP, but so you do Rite 1, 1 year, and the next year you move to Rite 2, and the next year you move to Rite 3, and then each day is you are given a gospel reading, an epistle, a psalm, and maybe a series of other readings. Many of them all seem to be interrelated with each other. Not always, but there is a connection for many of them. And so each day, they call it the daily office. But every Sunday, there is a designated lectionary. There's a designated biblical series of text that the priest or the vicar was supposed to preach from, at least one or all those texts. And so this pastor is ignoring that, right? And what he's done is he's taken just a few of the biblical passages that he enjoys, particularly from the Psalms, and he just keeps recycling them. So and for whatever reason, he's lazy. Maybe he thinks those are the only ones that are acceptable to his congregation, but he just keeps recycling them over and over again. We are thus safe from the danger that any we are thus safe from the danger that any truth not already familiar to him and to his flock should ever reach them through Scripture. But perhaps your patient is not quite silly enough for this church, or not yet. So this is a church you would want to be critical of. This is a church that if you attended there, you ought to say, okay, this cannot be the place where I can be fed, because this is not food. This is garbage, what this priest is offering. And so you should reject that and not be a part of that church body in that particular way. On the other church, we have Father Spike. The humans are often puzzled to understand the range of his opinions. Why he is one day almost a communist, and the next not so far from the kind of theocratic fascism, and one day a scholastic, and the next prepared to deny human reason altogether. one day immersed in politics, and the day after declaring that all states of this world are equally under judgment. So let me read that again because he's describing how this guy is all over the place and the different kinds of things. So the real issue here is that this pastor doesn't have a coherent biblical approach to how he preaches on Sunday. That he seems to be um, susceptible to his emotions. He is spontaneous, not focused. And so on the other church, we have Father Spike. The humans are often puzzled to understand the range of his opinions. So you have these congregations like, where's he coming from? Like, what, and there are pastors like this. We, of course, oh, I'm sorry. The humans are often puzzled to understand the range of his opinions. Why he is one day almost a communist, and the next not far from some kind of theocratic fascism, whatever that looks like. One day a scholastic, like he's a professor or acts like a professor, and the next prepared to deny human reason altogether, uh, which is where many of our pastors are increasingly moving towards, uh, denying human reason. One day immersed in politics, which is again very interesting because, whatever you're bent on this. So if you are in a church that discusses social policy that comes down on the side of conservatism, then you are being political. That's the interpretation. But if you are in a church that discusses social policy that would come down on the side of liberals or leftists, you are not being political. You are being prophetic. You are being just and compassionate. So there seems to be this bifurcation here about how we see social issues, important social issues, discussed, and what the biblical text would say to that about Christian living, about what our values really ought to be. Um, so then he goes on to say, and the day after, declaring that all states of this world are equally under judgment. So a kind of fundamentalist approach. We, of course, see the connecting link, which is hatred. The man cannot bring himself to preach anything which is not calculated to shock, grieve, puzzle, or humiliate his parents and their friends. So, so there's a kind of style here where this priest or pastor or whomever wants to be so relevant that he's a shock jock kind of guy. And oftentimes these pastors can become celebrity pastors. So I once watched a pastor online who was preaching. He was preaching about something that was fairly important. It had some kind of a social component to it, although I cannot remember exactly what it was. And then he concluded, what he said about that and was looking around the congregation as if he interpreted their looking back at him as disconnected or uncaring. So he's looking at them and and reading them and thinking like, what I just said didn't seem to matter to you. And then he literally said, full word, literally said, F it. Well, apparently that got everyone's attention. This was a celebrity pastor who had a large online presence. And to my knowledge, I don't think he suffered any kind of repercussion for that. But his intent was to shock. Um, and I guess because, allegedly he tried every other way to get their attention, it didn't work. And so he thought that was the last recourse. So we as pastors have to be really, really careful, the spirit and the nature, in terms of how. So, why do we communicate what we communicate? Do we communicate because those principles, those laws are really important? Or do we communicate them because, we're trying to be relevant, because we're insecure? But what's the reason? What's the motivation? I'm not sure we're very good anymore at discerning those kinds of things. A sermon which such people could accept would be to him as insipid. The word insipid means tasteless. A sermon which some people could accept to him would be as insipid as a poem which they could scan. There's also a promising streak of dishonesty in him. I bet there is. We are teaching him to say, quote, the teaching of the church is, end quote, when he really means, quote, I'm almost sure I read recently in the Martian or someone of that sort. So it's how he presents it. So he'll take some kind of ambiguous principle or term, and he presents it as if this is from the biblical text, when in reality he read it in some other kind of extra biblical source. He liked the principle and thought he would include it. But I must warn you that he has one fatal defect. He really believes, and this may yet mar all. So, sincerity of belief, Screwtape is saying, is a compelling thing. And, if there is a person who is sincere in what they believe, even if they convey most of what they convey that to be untrue, if there's a thing or two that is really true that he conveys and sincerely believes, there's something to that. He may not be entirely reprobate uh, in that regard. But there is one good point which both these churches have in common. They are both party churches. I think I warned you before that if your patient can't be kept out of the church, he ought to at least be violently attached to some party within it. Violently attached to some party within it. Well, how many times have we seen that over the years, right? I don't mean on really doctrinal issues. About those, the more lukewarm he is, the better. So don't get him to be violently attached to some particular doctrinal issue, because as soon as it stays in the realm of doctrine, then you're talking about truth, and you're talking about the precision of truth and the efficacy of truth. He doesn't he doesn't really want him to focus, although this has happened many, many times, way too many times. I mean, look, most of the denominations that we have today, there are 20,000 denominations in the world today, at least, and all 20,000 of them are their own denomination over doctrinal issues, right? It's because they can't agree on what they believe to be certain essentials of the faith. So some believe, for example, in some churches belong to the Reformed tradition, some belong to an Arminian tradition, some belong to a Pentecostal charismatic tradition, some belong to an ecclesiastical like a Roman Catholic, a Greek Orthodox tradition, whatever those traditions are. I mean, you can start with that. But even within those traditions, uh, you have in the Protestant versus Roman Catholic, you have some people who are baptized as believers and some people who are baptized only as infants. I mean, understand that during the Reformation, people who had been baptized as infants and then came in Roman Catholicism, or even in Lutheranism, and people who came to faith and then were later baptized as adults, that was seen as heresy, and some of those people died. I mean, they were killed for that kind of a heresy over baptism, and that's just one of dozens of reasons why churches split over certain practices and things like that. So there's this divisive thing. He says, so if there's going to be a division, the preference would be not so much over doctrine, but the preference would be over certain practices. So he says, I don't mean on really doctrinal issues about those. The more lukewarm he is, the better. And it isn't the doctrines on which we chiefly depend for producing malice. The real fun is working up hatred between those who say, quote, Mass, end quote, and those who say, quote, Holy Communion, end quote. So Mass then is the celebration of the Lord's Supper. And so apparently he's saying, look, there are some people in some churches who use the word Mass. So even in our church, when I first came to Conway Alliance, we always refer to it as the Lord's Supper predominantly, then the word communion. But because of my educational background at Trinity for School for Ministries, which is Anglican, I was comfortable with using the word the Eucharist, which means celebration. So of course I could never use the word Mass, right? Because that would be too Roman Catholic. So over time, I have worked the word Eucharist into our celebration of the Lord's Supper, but not as much as I've used the word the Lord's Supper or communion. All those words are fine. All those terms are fine. But for some people, those are fighting words. Those are words that you have to use this term, otherwise you're going to offend somebody. And so there are a plethora of words and terms and practices that that will divide even a local church, let alone a denomination. And so, you know, politics divides a local church, and sometimes that's unavoidable, but not as much as it should be, or as it often is. So, you think about that too. Think about, I've read of a church that split because the congregants could not decide what color the new pew cushions ought to be. Couldn't decide. Many churches have split over, contemporary music versus hymns. And bitterness. I mean, hatred for each other, because they could not come to an agreement about what kind of music should be played, or whether there should be drums or a guitar or those kinds of things, or how people should dress, or whether or not you should have a Sunday evening service or a Wednesday evening service, and all of those kinds of things. The list is rather endless, that of the things that Satan can use to divide a church over things that really don't matter and ought not to matter. So I love how Lewis writes this in the name of Screwtape. The real fun is working up hatred between those who say Mass and those who say Holy Communion. I mean, what's the difference, right? It's so trivial, and that's what makes it fun to the enemy. Like, these people are so stupid. They are so naive. They are so gullible. We can actually get them to split over the difference between the term Mass and Holy Communion. They mean the same thing. Doesn't matter, all right? People will get mad, and they will fight, and they will even garner hatred towards each other, because so these things take on a life of their own, and they destroy and dissolve many a good church. So, which neither party could possibly state the difference between. Okay. So, say Hooker's doctrine and Thomas Aquinas in any form which would hold water for 5 minutes. So a lot of times people can't even make those distinctions. So Mass, involves communion, but it involves a larger worshiping element. Holy Communion is specifically the Eucharist, but because one person uses a more general term than the other, it gets them into trouble. And all the purely indifferent things, candles and cloths and whatnot, are admirable ground for our activities. So we have to keep the main thing, right? Um, you know, Again, when I first came to the church that I'm at now, uh, one of the interesting things that we had to employ or introduce to our church was for them to understand. There were a couple of things. One was that the history of that church came down on an overt emphasis on biblical truth and less of an emphasis on biblical grace. And so, I spent a number of years really focusing on biblical grace, not to the detriment of biblical truth, because there is no grace. Uh, Grace is not necessary unless truth is a reality, and truth. The whole of the truth is that there is grace, not just do's and don'ts, but the grace is also a primary piece of what we know to be truth in relationship to God as well. So those things work in conjunction with each other. And so we tried to strike that balance. About 10 years after I got there, I then had to kind of refocus back on truth again because of how our culture became increasingly more and more postmodern. And so meta narratives like the Judeo-Christian worldview, the creation account, all those kinds of things were being attacked by the culture. And so we had to move back more closely to an emphasis on biblical truth to help educate our people in regard to that. And so there was a fluidity that's there. But I guess this is the point I wanted to get to, was that it took a while for our people to understand that you could no longer count on the Judeo-Christian worldview to help convey the means of grace and the whole counsel of, in other words, at one time in our culture, the Judeo-Christian worldview was a starting point for everybody in the culture, but now that's no longer true. It is no longer a starting point. Progressivism is a starting point for most people in our culture, and so the church had to become missiological. It had to become like, we had to become a missions entity, not just an evangelistic entity. There's a difference between the two, but a missions entity, a missiological church. So we had to see ourselves as missionaries within the world in which we lived. That was a hard shift for many of our people because they just didn't get it. They didn't understand why that was important. Nonetheless, as a pastor, I believe that those were highly defensible, biblically speaking, and um, for some people they couldn't go there, and for others, they embraced it. And we moved on, and it was a good thing. So so you have that dynamic, which is a really important thing. But we had some people who left because they didn't like the music, and they didn't like some of the things that we did to the sanctuary. None of which was earth shaking, but for them it was, and they found another place, and that's fine. They were able to continue on in their faith there, and they didn't really attempt to be divisive in our church, which was a good thing. So my point is that so we have this dynamic where churches are highly susceptible to division and even hatred over things that don't really matter on one hand, and yet on the other hand, in order to live within the world in which we find ourselves, there are certain things that are of not eternal consequence that we have to change in order to help people learn what is of eternal consequence. And so sometimes that's music, and sometimes that's stress, and sometimes that's technology, and sometimes that's how we do outreach. There were things in the past that were tried and true, and they became traditional. And then when they would no longer work, those things were sacred to some people. And even though they didn't work anymore, and so the sacred investment was misguided as far as from my perspective. And so that's why we had to change some of the things we have to change, and why we will change things in the future that we have to change, because we live in a world of change. So, the message stays the same, and that is what is sacred. It can never change. The method is what must change, because it's the method that helps that helps the message to become more real, more available, more accessible, more amenable to people out in the world. So this is a bit of a rabbit trail, but I wanted to fill in some of the lines here in terms of the dynamics that oftentimes happen. There's much more I could say, and I could probably say more accurately and more competently, but I think you get what I'm talking about here. We have quite removed from men's minds what the pestilent fellow Paul used to teach about food and other unessentials, namely that the human without scruples should always give in to the humans with scruples. The human without scruples. So he's saying here, we have quite removed from men's minds what the pestilent fellow Paul used to teach about food and other unessentials. In principle, this is what I was just talking about. Namely, that the human without scruples or principles should always give in to the human with scruples. You would think they could not fail to see the application. You would expect to find the, quote, low, end quote, churchman genuflecting and crossing himself, lest the weak conscience of his, quote, high, end quote, brother should be moved to irreverence, and that the high one referring from those exercises, lest he should betray his low brother into idolatry. So, and so he's talking about the practice of genuflecting, which is this sign, the sign of the cross, that many Anglicans, Lutherans, Roman Catholics, Greek Orthodox use in their worship service, and how the motive behind why some people do that, and maybe the consequences with that. So then he goes on to say, and so it would have been but for our ceaseless labor. Without that, the variety of usage within the Church of England might have become a positive hotbed for charity and humility. So get your patient. If he's going to be in a church, get him to invest himself and believe in those things that are not really essential. And then in the whole of the church, find those people who will be invested in stuff that really doesn't matter. And then use that as a way to be divisive within the church and to blow it up. And so Screwtape goes on to say, in so many words, they're so susceptible to this. It's not hard to fool them. They're really unsophisticated in their thinking, because we really can distract them, and we really can hijack them in this way, so that they really get at each other on things that really don't matter. And then what happens? How many church damaged people do you know in your lifetime that are church damaged precisely because of the things that we were just talking about here? So that those of us who belong to a church have to be very diligent about keeping the main thing, and that for those things that we disagree with, we can't be obsessed about it. You let it go. You may not agree with it, you may not like it, it's not your taste, not your style, but it's not anything that impacts the truth of Scripture, or even maybe eternity in any way. And so you let it go, and you learn to live with it. Some people have the kind of conscience where they can eat meat offered to idols, and some people, because they were idol worshippers and they sacrificed meat to those idols, it's a flashback and they can't do it. In either case, the Apostle Paul says, let the person who has, whose conscience is not violated, let them eat meat. offered to idols when they go to somebody's house for dinner. But the person for whom that is difficult, uh, don't offer them meat given to idols. Don't. If you invite them to dinner, make sure that that meat has not been sacrificed at a temple someplace. Give them meat that's fresh and pure in that regard. And so the believer who is fragile and susceptible to that needs to understand that there are other believers out there who can do that, and it doesn't bother them, and vice versa. So be sensitive to the one who is affected by those kinds of things, and for those people who are affected by those kinds of things, have the spiritual maturity. People in the church, I mean, who are not affected by those kinds of things, and thereby maintain a decorum of unity, effective unity in the church. So, let me give you some biblical texts um, that I have for you, and if you're writing any down, you may want to write this down. The first is First John chapter 4, beginning with verse 1. First John chapter 4, beginning with verse 1, and then Hebrews 10, 25, and then Hebrews 13, 7 through 9, and 17, 7 through 9 and 17. 1 John 4, 1, Hebrews 10, 25, Hebrews 13, 7 through 9, and then verse 17 in addition to that as well. And then I think, I think I would offer, and I believe this conversation takes place in Corinthians, about meat being offered to idols, and I do not recall the specific reference, but I would include that text in here as well, where Paul has that discussion about meat that's offered to idols and the freedom of conscience associated with that. I would include that text in here as well. So it's easy to find. I just don't know it off the top of my head. I have not memorized, and I am terrible at memorization, but I have not memorized the whole of the Bible yet. So in any case, so here are the three biblical texts I think that would be helpful to to write down and think about. This is from Hebrews 10, 20, 24. And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and to good works. And then 25, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. So let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another. So, just this commitment to the local church, and as being the local church, stirring up in each other um, love for each other, and a desire to do good works in the same way that James encourages us to do that as well. And then this next passage I want to read is from 1 John. Okay. So 1 John chapter 4. I don't know if I included that. Did I include 1 John chapter 4? I think I did. But I thought this text was important because it goes to this. Let's see here. 1 John chapter 4. I apologize. Just want to make sure I give you the right text for this. Okay, yeah. So I didn't mark it here, but here it is. 1 John chapter 4, verse 1. Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God, for many false prophets have gone out into the world. And so this is an admonition by John. Look, whatever church you go to, if you're looking for a new church, well, and there's a person there teaching that you haven't heard teach before, be diligent in testing, the Spirit is what they are saying from the Holy Spirit. because there are many false prophets and there are many false teachers in the world in which we live. And we have to be very discerning about who those false teachers are, um, and and how we're gonna handle that. The last one is from Hebrews 13, and so the author of Hebrews records this from 13, verse 7. Remember your leaders, those who spoke to you the word of God. Consider the outcome of their way of life and imitate their faith. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. Do not be led away by diverse and strange teachings, for it is good for the heart to be strengthened by grace, not by foods, which have not benefited those who devoted to them. So then he goes on to say, he's basically saying, look, again, this is in the spirit of 1 John 4, that attend to your leaders. So in whatever way that their life imitates Christ, imitate their life as well, and adhere to their teaching in whatever way their teaching represents the full counsel of God, and His teaching, and then to be very careful about diverse and strange teachings. And then verse 17, where he says, "Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they are keeping watch over your souls, as those who will have to give an account. Let let them do this with joy and not with groaning, for that would be of no advantage to you." So great words for a pastor who's determined not to ever abuse the trust that a person would give them. Here's I think a wonderful chapter and some biblical text that would be very helpful to any of us. So if you would make a few comments, let me know who's here, and anything that we talked about that was helpful. Share this with others, please. We are picking up more and more people who are listening to us and who come along afterwards and watch it as well. So please do that. It would just helpful and encouraging to me to know who's online right now, if you would, and then also if you would share and tell other people about this too, that would be great. Okay. By the way, I'm also looking for any of these chapters that we've done that you've had difficulty hearing. We're still trying to figure that out, whether that is on your end or on our end. We've done whatever we can to fix what might be happening on our end, but in particular chapters 3 and chapters 4, and I think chapter either 13 or 14, some people said were difficult to hear. If that was difficult for you to hear and you're listening to it, let me know, and if we can redo them or should redo them, we will. Okay, so let me know who's here. Thank you very much. Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you, Ruth, and I appreciate it very much. You guys take care. All right, blessings.